Elizabeth Brooks was 34 years old, an environmental engineer living and working in Omaha, and she had walked into that Sunday dinner expecting nothing more than overcooked roast and polite conversation. The dining table was set the way it always was, familiar and heavy with routine. Her parents sat across from her, her brother beside his wife, everyone in their usual places. The roast sat untouched, steam thinning into the air. Then her father leaned forward, his voice flat and cold, as if he had rehearsed the words. He told her she could either move into the guest room or leave the house altogether. His eyes stayed locked on her, unblinking, leaving no room for negotiation. Before I continue, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from today. Your support truly helps this channel grow. Before Elizabeth could respond, her brother jumped in, barely hiding his satisfaction. He said it would be better if she was gone by morning. The fork slipped from her hand and clattered against the plate, the sound too loud in the sudden silence. She had been paying most of the household expenses for years, electricity, repairs, appliances, even the refrigerator humming beside them. Now she was being spoken to like a burden. Her sister-in-law smiled faintly, eyes sharp, as if she had just won something she had been quietly competing for. Elizabeth tried to explain, her voice shaking as she listed what she had paid for, but her father cut her off with a dismissive wave and said the decision was final. Her mother said nothing. She stared at her plate, fingers tightening around her napkin, refusing to meet Elizabeth's eyes. That silence hurt more than the words. Anger rose fast and hot in Elizabeth's chest, crowding out the shock. She pushed her chair back and stood, her movements steady despite the tremor in her hands. She grabbed her keys and told them she was leaving. No one stopped her. That night, she packed only what was hers. She unplugged the television she had bought, loaded the couch and coffee maker into her car, and walked out of the house she had been helping hold together for years. A week later, just as Elizabeth was settling into the quiet of her new apartment, her phone rang. It was her mother. Her voice sounded strained, thin, like it might break. Before Elizabeth could speak, she heard her brother shouting in the background, his voice cracking with panic. He kept repeating that someone was lying and demanded their mother tell him it wasn't true. The chaos poured through the phone, sharp and uncontrolled, colliding with the calm Elizabeth had only just begun to build. Whatever was happening, it was serious, and it had reached them faster than she expected. Years earlier, Elizabeth had moved back into her parents' home to help after her grandmother passed away, and the bills began stacking up. Mortgage payments, utilities, and long-ignored repairs threatened to overwhelm them. As an environmental engineer, she was working long hours, often 60 hours a week, juggling site inspections and late-night reports. Most of her paycheck went straight into the house, new windows, a water heater, keeping the lights on. Her father would nod when she handed him receipts, but his attention always drifted back to her brother. Even then, Elizabeth sensed she was not seen as a daughter making sacrifices, but as a solution that could be quietly relied on. Elizabeth learned early that her brother, Eric, carried an unusual talent for failure that never seemed to cost him anything. He jumped from one idea to the next, always convinced the next attempt would be the one that changed everything. There was the food truck that never opened, the phone app that drained their father's savings, and an online store that vanished before its first year ended. Each time, Eric returned home with a new pitch and louder confidence. Their father listened closely, asking questions, offering encouragement, nodding like a man watching potential take shape. Elizabeth would stand nearby, holding receipts or repair estimates, waiting for a moment that never came. One evening, as Elizabeth handed her father a stack of utility bills, she heard her mother speaking softly in the kitchen. "She's only here to help keep things together," her mother whispered. "Eric is the one with ambition." The words landed harder than any argument. Elizabeth stepped back before she could be seen, her chest tightening. She wasn't living there to be saved or supported. She was living there to keep the roof from collapsing, to keep the heat running through winter. Yet in their eyes, her effort was practical, not impressive. It was expected, not celebrated. Everything shifted when Eric brought his wife home for dinner. Lauren arrived wearing confidence like a tailored coat, heels clicking across the floor as if she already owned the place. She introduced herself as a real estate agent, smiling brightly, shaking hands firmly. Their parents were instantly charmed. Over dinner, Lauren talked about listings and investments, using just enough polished language to sound impressive without offering details. Eric watched her with open pride. Elizabeth asked simple questions about her clients and properties, but Lauren brushed them aside, laughing and changing the subject to a deal she said was almost closed. As weeks passed, Elizabeth noticed things that didn't add up. Lauren arrived with shopping bags from stores Elizabeth avoided even on sale. She flashed a new phone one night and called it a business expense. Eric laughed and praised her drive. Their father slapped Eric on the back and told him he had chosen well. Elizabeth's salary barely covered the house expenses, yet Lauren spent freely, effortlessly. When Elizabeth mentioned the imbalance to her mother, she was waved off. "Some people are just good with money," her mother said. "Don't be so suspicious." Elizabeth nodded, but the feeling in her gut refused to settle. Lauren had a way of steering conversations. At dinner, she spoke about flipping properties, dropping words like leverage and equity that made their father lean in closer. Eric listened as if she were explaining the future. When Elizabeth tried to mention that she had just paid the property taxes, her father interrupted. "Let her finish," he said, eyes still on Lauren. Elizabeth fell silent. She watched Lauren glance at her, a brief smile crossing her face, sharp and knowing. In that moment, Elizabeth understood something had shifted in the house. She was no longer the one holding things together. She was background noise, useful only when a bill needed paying. Outside of dinner, the imbalance became impossible to ignore. Eric borrowed Elizabeth's car without asking, leaving notes that said he had meetings and would bring it back later. When she objected, their father told her not to make things difficult. Lauren treated the house like a temporary stop, suggesting changes to the living room and commenting on how the guest room would make a perfect office. Elizabeth overheard her one afternoon saying, "Once everything's settled, we'll reorganize." The word everything lingered in Elizabeth's mind. It sounded less like a plan and more like a claim. At night, Elizabeth lay awake in her childhood bedroom, staring at the ceiling fan as it clicked through uneven rotations. She thought about the promotions she had turned down to stay close, the weekends spent fixing pipes instead of resting. The math was impossible to ignore. She had poured more into that house than anyone else, yet her place in it felt smaller every day. Something about Lauren's smooth answers and perfect timing made Elizabeth uneasy. It felt like watching someone play a game while pretending it was casual conversation. The Sunday dinner arrived without warning. The table was set with her mother's old china, polished as if for a special occasion. Elizabeth assumed it was habit, nothing more. Her father carved the roast in silence while her mother adjusted napkins no one had touched. Then the front door opened, and Eric walked in dragging 2 suitcases. Lauren followed, designer bag slung over her shoulder, her smile already fixed in place. "We're moving in," Eric announced, dropping the bags near the stairs. No one laughed. No one asked how long they planned to stay. Elizabeth looked to her father, waiting for explanation. He didn't look up. "You can take the guest room or move out," he said calmly, as if discussing seating arrangements. Elizabeth felt her throat tighten. "What are you talking about?" she asked. Eric leaned back in his chair. "We need space," he said. "You'll be fine." Lauren scanned the room, nodding slightly, as though measuring walls. Elizabeth's voice sharpened despite herself. "I've been paying for this house," she said. "The mortgage. The repairs. The appliances." Her father sighed. "It's time for you to step back," he replied. "They have plans." The word plans landed like an insult. Elizabeth turned to her mother, searching for support. Her mother's eyes stayed fixed on the table. "Say something," Elizabeth said quietly. Nothing came. Eric smiled and said she wasn't essential, that she was just there. Lauren covered a laugh with her hand. Something in Elizabeth broke open. She listed everything she had sacrificed, every weekend and every dollar, her voice shaking but clear. Her father slammed his hand on the table and ended the conversation. The room felt smaller, air heavy with finality. Elizabeth pushed back her chair, stood, and said she was leaving. No one tried to stop her. Elizabeth packed with a calm that surprised her. She folded clothes, slid her laptop into its case, and unplugged everything she had paid for. In the living room, she disconnected the television and rolled the couch cushions toward the door. Eric hovered nearby, amused. "You're really taking the couch?" he asked. Elizabeth didn't look at him. "I bought it," she said simply. Their father stood in the doorway, arms crossed, calling it unnecessary drama. Elizabeth loaded the last box into her car and drove away, the house shrinking in her mirror. She wasn't abandoning them. She was stepping out of a role they had forced on her. She moved into a small apartment downtown, bare and quiet, but hers. Her co-worker Megan helped her unpack, handing her a cup of takeout coffee and studying the empty space.
"You did the right thing," Megan said.
Elizabeth shrugged, exhaustion settling in. Megan suggested a yoga studio nearby, insisting it helped clear the mind. Elizabeth laughed it off at first, but the next evening she showed up anyway, stiff and uncertain. The room was warm, the movements slow. For the first time in weeks, her breathing steadied. Even as life began to stabilize, Elizabeth couldn't ignore the unease surrounding Lauren. The spending, the vague deals, the confidence without substance. Elizabeth called Andrew Keller, a former colleague in real estate.
"I need to ask you something," she said. She described Lauren's work and lifestyle.
Andrew paused. "That name's familiar," he said carefully. "Her firm has complaints. Inflated appraisals, questionable loans. Nothing public yet, but it's not clean." Elizabeth felt the warning tighten in her chest.
She called her father that night.
"You need to hear this," Elizabeth said, explaining what she had learned.
His response was sharp. "Stay out of it," he told her.
"They are adults." She called her mother next, her voice steady but urgent. "Something's wrong."
Her mother sighed.
"Let it go," she said. "They are happy." Elizabeth ended the calls feeling dismissed all over again. She knew then that no warning would matter unless it came too late. Elizabeth began quietly collecting information. Public records showed properties tied to Lauren that had sold at suspicious prices. An old client confirmed legal complaints against the firm. Each detail painted the same picture. This wasn't ambition.
It was deception.
Elizabeth kept everything to herself, saving documents, tracking dates. She didn't feel vengeful. She felt responsible, even after everything. If the truth surfaced, it would be because it could no longer be ignored, not because she had forced it into the light. 2 weeks later, Elizabeth ran into Diane Foster at a quiet cafe near the river. Diane had known the family for years, the kind of woman who noticed details and remembered names. After polite conversation, Elizabeth mentioned Eric's wife. Diane's expression shifted immediately. "Lauren Hayes?" she asked, lowering her voice. "I knew her years ago, back when she worked in Lincoln."
Elizabeth leaned in.
Diane explained that Lauren had been tied to a firm accused of forging signatures and inflating property values. Lawsuits followed, but Lauren walked away before things collapsed.
"She was clever," Diane said.
"Always one step ahead." Elizabeth left the cafe with her stomach tight. This wasn't speculation anymore.
It was a pattern.
Elizabeth drove to her parents' house that same afternoon. Eric was unloading groceries, humming to himself.
She showed him the messages and documents she'd gathered. "You need to see this," she said.
Eric skimmed the pages and scoffed. "You're jealous," he snapped.
"She's successful. You can't stand it."
Elizabeth stayed calm.
"This isn't about me," she said.
"She's risking the house." Eric laughed and told her to stop digging. Inside, Elizabeth tried once more with her mother, explaining everything carefully. Her mother stirred a pot on the stove and said only one thing. "Don't ruin their happiness." Elizabeth left without arguing. She finally understood that denial was easier for them than truth.
That evening, Andrew called Elizabeth back. His voice was tense.
"I pulled more records," he said. "Lauren's name is on a second mortgage tied to your parents' house."
Elizabeth sat down hard.
Andrew explained the loan had been taken out weeks earlier through a shell company. Payments hadn't been made. If the bank moved quickly, the house could be lost.
Elizabeth asked for everything he had.
She spent the night reviewing documents, dates, signatures. The evidence lined up too neatly to ignore.
Lauren hadn't just been reckless. She had been strategic.
A few nights later, Elizabeth received a call from her mother, barely whispering. "There are investigators here," she said. Elizabeth drove over immediately. 2 officials stood in the driveway, explaining they were looking for Lauren in connection with financial fraud. Eric paced behind their father, panic written across his face.
"She wouldn't do this," he kept saying.
The investigators explained the loans, the forged paperwork, the misused funds.
Lauren wasn't home. As they left, Lauren's car appeared down the street.
Elizabeth approached her, phone recording. Confronted with the evidence, Lauren admitted everything coldly.
"They signed," she said.
"They trusted me." Then she drove away. Inside the house, everything unraveled. Eric sat with his head in his hands, repeating that he hadn't known.
Their father looked older, smaller. Later that night, he called Elizabeth, his voice broken. We need you, he said.
The bank is calling in the loan.
Elizabeth listened quietly.
She remembered the dinner, the dismissal, the silence.
I warned you, she said.
You chose them over me. When she hung up, she felt something shift inside her.
It wasn't anger anymore. It was release. Whatever happened next would not be hers to carry.
In the months that followed, Elizabeth kept her distance. The bank moved quickly, and the house she had spent years supporting slipped out of her parents' hands. They downsized to a small rental on the edge of the city, their routines reshaped by limits they had never expected to face. Eric took temporary work and stopped talking about big ideas. Lauren disappeared completely, leaving behind debts, paperwork, and silence. Elizabeth heard updates through fragments and mutual contacts, but she did not step back in.
She focused instead on her own life.
Her work stabilized, then flourished. She accepted a leadership role she had once postponed, and for the first time, her time felt like it belonged to her.
Evenings were quiet. Mornings were calm.
She no longer woke with the weight of responsibility pressing down on her chest. Sometimes guilt surfaced, but it passed when she remembered how many chances she had given them to listen. 6 months later, Elizabeth sat in her apartment with Megan, sunlight cutting across the floor as they shared a bottle of wine after work. Plans for the future filled the room, simple and honest. Elizabeth felt lighter, not because the past had vanished, but because she had stopped carrying it. Her family's choices were theirs to live with, just as hers were her own. She had learned that love did not require self-erasure, and loyalty did not mean silence. Boundaries were not punishments. They were protections. When Elizabeth finally looked back, she did so without anger. Walking away had not broken her family. It had saved her. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. Sometimes the hardest thing we have to learn is that love doesn't mean losing ourselves. Setting boundaries isn't cruelty, it's self-respect. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had to walk away to protect your peace?
I'd love to hear your story.